Howdy Data Heroes, Kyle here at Anvilogic, and I just wanted to spend a few minutes today talking about some features that we think you'll find really interesting, especially if Snowflake is or is currently becoming a major part of your cybersecurity stack. So if you don't know who we are, Anvilogic is a SaaS cybersecurity software company that's built a detection engineering and hunting platform specifically for enterprise SOCs. We help you implement more accurate detections in a few clicks and hunt more efficiently irrespective of your data lakes and security tools. So with that out of the way, I wanted to quickly cover a few new capabilities we've launched here at Anvilogic that can turn any SOC team member that uses Snowflake into a cybersecurity data superhero. So today we're going to focus on two things. The first is detection creation. We know writing detections is as much art as it is science, and it's sometimes really hard. So going from zero to a working detection can take a super long time. In fact, customers before adopting Anvilogic often would spend weeks developing even just a single detection. And we actually help drive that down to minutes and hours, including the time it takes to, in this case, convince your Snowflake admin to let you deploy these. The lifecycle management of detections is also something that's very tricky. How do you version control? How do you manage the number of tasks deployed without creating an administrative bottleneck? So we'll talk about two things specifically in lifecycle management. We're going to discuss version control and writing new content. One thing to note up front is that we do all of this in the context of your Snowflake account. So you own your own data. We're very, very transparent about what platform primitives we use within Snowflake. And so it's really just an extension of the skills your team already has today. So before getting into some of the main features, we're actually first going to talk about the Armory. This is where our Purple team publishes content for our users to import, update, and deploy to their security analytics platforms. As you can see, we invest a lot of time in research, and we map all of our detections to MITRE ATT&CK and to specific threat actors, some pretty standard stuff there. We also annotate what we call use cases with a ton of metadata. So if I go into the full Armory, what you'll see is that we have this concept of threat identifiers. Those are really the core detections. And if I filter down, and I can even look at things like rule format, or is it tied to a vulnerability, or other threat groups. So this metadata is really what helps you filter and sort out what's important to you. We'll also talk about recommendations in a minute. But if I pick, for example, the Snowflake rule format, we really consider Snowflake a first-class data repository and rule format. Really, in order to get the performance that any mature SOC needs, we need to really write those detections in the native language of the analytics engine that they've deployed. And we'll talk a little bit about Snowflake SQL in a minute and how you can write your own. But if you see here, if I look at the details, obviously we have content that doesn't look like, I'd say, probably a normal piece of SQL. And we'll talk more about the details here in a minute. But again, if you look at things like tags, we talked about metadata earlier, your team can tag up any analytics, whether they're from Anvilogic or ones that you've authored yourself, again, to help sort of map those to your priorities, to the threat groups you're concerned about, and also just to help sort of evolve that sort of content management in your world. So that said, if we go back to the Armory, one of the things that I think is really, really important is to understand, like, what is the most important thing I can deploy for my environment that matters to me. And so while we won't discuss it today, you do input a little bit of data about sort of what platforms you have deployed, what industry you're in, etc. And we actually provide a number of recommendations. And so if I sort these detections from high to low for recommendations, you'll see we're super duper transparent about our recommendation engine. So yes, we're using AI and machine learning, but we're super transparent about sort of the math behind that, right? It's not magic here. It's like, hey, it matches your prioritized techniques. It matches the data you already have deployed and in Snowflake. And based off of that, we score those things and we just tell you, hey, it might actually be worth your while, to use these. So really writing detections from taking that sort of weeks-long effort and consolidating it down into, in this case, just minutes, is very, very simple. And really to go from here, I just add to my workspace and deploy. So once I have something added to my workspace, the next step is actually just as easy as well. So if I look at, for example, one of the existing threat identifiers we have in place today, you'll see this is a pretty complex detection if you look at the sort of the code block piece. Again, we'll talk about how we make that a lot easier. But the beauty of this is that testing this or changing it is all a matter of just pointing and clicking. I can revert back to the Armory version. I can make changes to it. I can test it immediately as well. So if I click test, I'm actually able to execute this live in my existing Snowflake environment. And the way that we do this is actually pretty clever. Like I mentioned, we already use the Snowflake that you have deployed. What we do is we effectively terraform your environment. So if I look at, in our case, Anvilogic Labs, we deploy an Anvilogic namespace and schema. And then under that, there's a number of things like tables, views, and tasks. And tasks are where the detections actually get deployed, scheduled, and run. The underlying engine for this is still Snowflake, but what we've done is abstracted on top of that a number of UDFs. And those UDFs help you author these things in what we call a layer file. So if we go back to the layer file and we take a peek at the code behind, what's actually executing is this layer sort of recipe, if you will. And the recipe has a bunch of pre-built components. So really, this becomes a drag and drop exercise. It doesn't require you to know a whole bunch about how Snowflake operates or how to administrate it or how to create a view or any of that stuff. Super duper simple. And in fact, if we want to go through this sort of ad hoc, let's create a new piece of content, go to thread identifier. We'll click rule builder, which is our new low code, no code builder. All right, so when we're talking about authoring detections from scratch, it's actually really, really simple. As we mentioned before with those layer files, generating the layer file we all do on the back end, meaning Anvilogic takes care of all that complexity for you. All you have to do is drag and drop, pick your data source, which in this case is one of the macros I mentioned before. So we're looking at endpoint data, which has all the normalization, all the data onboarding we handle for you. And then here I am with the code block. So I need to go figure out how to write a detection. Let's use an example like maybe trying to find the term download string in a PowerShell command. So Monty AI, as I mentioned before, has been trained on the latest OpenAI large language model, and we've fine-tuned it with a bunch of our metadata and knowledge base from our security team. And now all I have to do is ask a simple question like, hey, show me events where the process field contains something like download string, which is a common one for Cobalt Strike one-liners, right? Immediately it generates a regex process for me. I'm going to give that a big old thumbs up. I'm going to click copy. And then all I need to do is paste this into my code block. I then add a few more pieces of things like a definition for it, again tagging it with that metadata so we can manage it through its entire lifecycle. We'll say Cobalt Strike example. Okay, and all we have to do is very quickly say, let's find some events. And again, writing no SQL myself, relying completely on the Anvilogic platform as well as Monty AI. You'll see immediately we now have at least an early version of a working detection. So as you can see, after that point, I can choose to edit it some more or I can save it. I tag it again with all the metadata you saw before. All the version control stuff you saw previously also applies to this detection I just authored myself. And more importantly, this all, again, can get deployed in real time down to your Snowflake environment with full transparency in terms of scheduling and availability. And really, at the end of the day, this is just a rinse and repeat exercise. We believe very, very strongly that this has the power to truly democratize detection engineering for the entire SOC. So I hope you had at least an informative session today watching me talk about some of the cool stuff we're putting out into the market. Next time, we're probably going to follow up on things like tuning insights and managing what happens after you've deployed these into your Snowflake environment and you're generating alerts, right? How do you sort of deal with the downstream allow listing and triage processes associated with that? But that's for next time. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.